All right, welcome to today's PAVE virtual panel, AV Fact versus Fiction. PAVE started this virtual panel series almost 2 years ago to bring experts together who can address topics across the automated vehicle landscape. Our audience over the years has continued to submit thought-provoking questions, and we've also heard other questions repeated from the general public through our other activities as well. Today, we're going to do a big overview of some of those common questions and some misunderstandings that we hear about automated vehicles, and we've gathered a superstar set of panelists to address them. My name is Tabitha Coulter, and I'm PAVE's Director of Operations and today's moderator. Our first guest with us today is Bryant Walker-Smith, Associate Professor of Law at the University of South Carolina. Bryant, you've been one of my personal favorite academics to follow in the AV space for a while now, and we're very grateful you could join us today.
Thanks, Tabitha.
And our second panelist is returning to our PAVE panel series to continue our work in addressing public questions. Anuja Sonalker, CEO and founder of Steer. Anuja, so wonderful to have you back on to share your experience.
You. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So Bryant and Anuja are both highly qualified to answer a lot of these questions that I'm going to pose that are common ones we hear. Just for confusion's sake, I'm going to address each question to one of you directly, but please feel free to chime in at any point after the other panelists' answers as well. So the first question we hear commonly is a classic one, so I'm going to go ahead and get it out of the way. Anuja, can you buy a fully driverless vehicle today?
No, fully driverless vehicles, which means driverless anytime, anywhere, all of the time, which is what we call a level five fingers, is not yet a reality, let alone buying it today. But if you go one level down, which we call a level 4 highly automated vehicle, which can be driverless in some applications, some applications, some of the time, and only during those applications, if all of the conditions are met for those applications. Those kind of technologies are coming around, either in beta programs, but not yet available for purchase to the general public, or in forms where you can ride and use it, but not own it.
Great. Well, and a lot of times we hear that question because people are excited, they want to be able to drive one and buy one. But of course, on the flip side of that enthusiasm, we also often hear the opposite concern about being forced to adopt AV technology. So Bryant, what would you say to somebody who asks, when AVs come to my city, will they be shoved down our throats?
Two sides of the same coin. Yeah, I mean, billionaires have tried to buy themselves fully driverless vehicles and they haven't succeeded. So we have to wait a bit more. As for people who want to keep waiting, will they be shoved down our throats? Not in the sense of people will be compelled by law to use them in any foreseeable horizon. Now, they are likely to be part of the road traffic mixture. So in the same way that a 2-ton SUV is, I suppose, shoved down your throat if you're a pedestrian, all of these other vehicles will be part of the environment that we navigate. Now, increasingly, there will be driver safety features, which, as Anuja mentioned, are not automated driving, that will provide more and more of a cushion or buffer for drivers. So we'll still be driving, we'll still think we'll be driving, but there will be these systems that will help us and others, hopefully, to improve safety.
That's great.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, like Bryant said, there will always be an option to ride or drive the AV feature. And you can decline in the case of shared services. If a robo taxi shows up, you can decline and wait for another one. If it's a feature in your vehicle, you can turn it off or disable it for those non-shared use type of dedicated services. So it will not be shoved down anybody's throat. But to Brian's point, right, they will be in the ecosystem. So it's like living on a noisy street and you have vehicles going up and down. So it's being part of the ecosystem, we can't stop that. So they will be out and about and around. Well said.
Awesome. And Anuja, in the past, you've joined us for some panels where we discussed cybersecurity. So I'd love you to tackle this next one we hear, which is, are AVs more vulnerable to hacking than our current cars?
So I don't know what your current vehicle is. Everybody drives it different, but generally speaking, and at the attack surface level. So here's a new word, attack surface, which is the surface. If you take a pencil and draw an outline around your vehicle from the outside, like a boundary, all around the tires and back up. And then you draw a second outline around your vehicle from inside the cabin. This is what we call the attack surface. It's the surface through which somebody could potentially enter and penetrate your vehicle and your vehicle system. So at that attack surface level, generally speaking, yes, AVs are more vulnerable to hacking than your current vehicle. And more vulnerable does not mean that they will be hacked. It just means that there are more things that somebody could try to hack into. Of course, there has to have the attack potential. It has to have a exposed vulnerability that can be then leveraged by a motivated attacker and feasible for them to do it in the amount of time they have before your vehicle moves away or is in your possession. So all of those factors also come in, but the vulnerability is larger because the attack surface is far more complex and larger than your current vehicle.
Fascinating. That's really interesting. While we're kind of addressing potential areas of concern or things that we hear about, another one we hear about a lot is the labor issue. Bryant, how would you respond to a question of, won't a lot of people lose their jobs?
Yes, through a variety of technologies. It won't be that entire job categories are wholly eliminated, but automation can replace certain job tasks, which could potentially require fewer people to perform the same kind of output. But this is not limited to automated driving. This is an issue that's going to confront a range of technologies. Now, it's also true that automation could produce new kinds of jobs, new demands. What's unclear is whether that will replace existing jobs. And what's true of any technological transformation, and this is true throughout the 20th century or earlier, is that there is a transition problem. That is going from a world or a job that you are used to one that you are not, is on an individual level hard and disruptive. So this is a reality of any technology that needs to be part of the conversation for how we use these technologies to serve goals and not the other way around.
Anuja, anything to add there?
No, I'm fully aligned with Bryant, and automation can be not necessarily take over an entire task. It can be something that makes work or life easier, safer, more convenient, less stressful, any of the above, all of the above. And just like the advent of email for automating parts of the process of sending mail to others, it did not cause loss of jobs. It just caused a shift in the way postal mail is handled and a shift in the way we operate because the messages are coming so much. So it spawned a whole software industry and higher jobs, improved overall savviness of people and the economics of average households. So this is true of any technology, any software, any system that is becoming more efficient by using some technology to automate itself and get better, right? So AVs will also have an economic impact. We'll still need the jobs. We still need the people who build AVs, operate them, maintain them, develop various aspects of AVs, develop peripherals around them, other programs, administer governments, a lot of things, right? So there is a transformation, but not necessarily equated to job loss.
And as we think through that transformation you both discussed, we hear a question a lot of, what can we do to ensure that this technology will represent a positive step forward, especially for those who socially, economically are less fortunate? Bryant?
Yeah. Oh, there are short-term and long-term answers to this. The reality of any progress, any technology, is we replace an old set of problems with a new set of problems and just really hope that our new set in aggregate is less than our old set. This was true of transitioning from the horse, which was incredibly polluting, right? 25 pounds of manure per horse per day, to the internal combustion engine. Turns out incredibly polluting. there are always going to be these challenges. And I really appreciate that question because it asks, how can we prepare? How can we harness these technologies to actually serve the social good? Now, even without anything, vehicles that are safer are going to improve safety, not just for their occupants, but for others, even those who do not have access to them. If done right, and I think cities like Oakland or Baltimore have really given a lot of thought to this in the context of scooters, that is providing mobility on a wider basis, then you could potentially serve populations that are very poorly served by the motor vehicle dominated transport today with on-demand services that are potentially cheaper, that are potentially faster and more accessible. Now, on the other hand, there is a concern that the more that we institutionalize services that kind of operate on the margins today, the more that we're going to unintentionally raise the costs of those services for everybody. So I don't want to suggest that this is a pie in the sky utopic vision. It will require people at every level in the design, in the deployment, in the regulation, in the policy development to actually care about society as a whole. And at every one of those steps, ask, how can we use this for good?
Very well said. Anuja, anything else to add there?
Agree. I think you, Bryant, said so eloquently. What this technology does is it has the promise and the potential to make things more equitable, to make transportation and mobility more equitable than it has been before for the young, the old, the specially abled, the marginalized, etc. Right? But we have to zoom out and look at the big picture. The technology can only bring the potential and the ability to make a change and to create an impact. We still need actors who will operationalize that tech for that purpose, right? So it is, in my mind, a public-private partnership. There are more humans, more actors involved, agencies, like Bryant said, right? Organizations, agencies, the tech providers, everybody combined with a common goal that we want to serve. The operative word that Bryant provided is to serve. The technology can only serve the purpose. The higher purpose comes from humans and the willingness to do what it takes to line up all the pegs correctly and to join all the dots correctly to make that experiential system come about. Technology alone cannot do that. The experiential system comes about because of adoption, and to clear the hurdles to adoption, there's regulation, there's so many things. From a step-by-step incremental way, I think baby steps are better than gigantic leaps. And so looking at the way movement is done today, looking at hotspots where this niche technologies can be useful, and then deploying them in those smaller, so point A to point B, keep it small, keep it simple, keep it routes that are underserved, or there is a lack of workforce to do the heavy lift that requires to get the frequency that you need to serve the population. Use it like that and build volume, build traffic, build usage, demonstrate the value, and then expand. There are so many organizations that are sitting on the fringes today to see, is this even possible? And so we get the art of the possible out there, and then there is a lot of help and good intentions.
Absolutely. Now I want to address, there's kind of a common scenario that I think is out there in the public discourse that a lot of times those of us in industry are pretty quick to dismiss as a little understated, but that's the trolley problem, which the trolley problem is a theoretical dilemma posed by philosophers where a driver or an AV is forced to essentially choose between two bad scenarios. Bryant, what would you say to a member of the public who that might be one of the little bits of knowledge that they've heard about autonomous vehicles and being in that situation?
Yeah, I would say that would be a very good problem to have because so often the crashes that result today, in which 40,000 people this year will die, are not the result of hypotheticals involving remote trade-offs. They're the result of inattention, distraction, irresponsibility at an individual level and at a systemic level of design and regulation. And so if we've eliminated all of that, and we get to these questions, I would say, well, how often have any of us had to, as we were driving down the road, say, oh gosh, should I hit this group of people or this group of people? Should I steer off to off the canyon cliff, or should I run into this motorcyclist? That is, I think, highly unlikely. Asteroids could hit, deer jump off of bridges, but it's not the kind of issue that confronts us every second of the day in the way that real road dangers do today. Now, there's a really valuable aspect of these discussions, which is thinking not about inevitable outcomes, but about risks that we take. Right? So how aggressive is a vehicle in merging? How aggressive is it in navigating other road users that might take advantage of timidity? Right? These are a question not of which outcome do you choose, but how much risk do you put into the system? And that is a real important question of design and really of social ethics that we should be talking about.
True. And talking about design and social ethics, right? I can take that a little bit 2 steps further. See, you're absolutely right? It's all about the risk. But the perception of risk can also be different. So most AVs have a decision tree logic that they're following. And the goal is always to minimize risk. And depending on the AV use case, it is whether it's minimizing risk to riders inside the vehicle, to passerbys outside the vehicle, to both, etc. It all depends on the AV. Some AVs don't carry humans, right? They carry goods, for example. So it all depends on the use case, but it's always calculating and it's always eliminating the riskiest propositions first and trying to maintain its risk position to whatever is the palatable risk. And it's trying to do that from further and further away in case of high speeds and faster and faster in case of others. And it's always eliminating the riskiest propositions. Besides that, at lower speeds, you can always stop to avoid the collisions. At higher speeds, you can, try to look out further and further. However, there may be situations, right? In the likelihood of probabilities game, there could be a situation where collision is imminent and you are faced with 2 choices, both of which have collision impact. Now, this is where, what Bryant said, risk perception of risk is different from the actual risk. And then the social biases that may be present. So what we can as designers do is eliminate social biases, eliminate any other kind of biases. So examples of a bias, right, is, and that leads to the risk perception, is if you're going to hit 2 similar sized vehicles, you cannot possibly know how many passengers are inside it. Or even if they're 2 different size vehicles and you judge, okay, one is a bus and one is a vehicle, you cannot use size to say, oh, the bus has more people and the station wagon, it could be a fully loaded station wagon with a full family, and it could be an empty bus returning from dropping off children, right? You can't tell what the risk proposition is just by computer vision recognition of that object. So it's far more complex, but we have to make sure that the system is not built with a design bias there, that size means higher risk, right? So it's more complicated than that.
Absolutely. And speaking of this idea of kind of what's out there in the public discourse when we think about AVs, we obviously see a lot of examples of overhype. I know we addressed in the first question that you can't buy a fully autonomous vehicle today, but PAVE has done surveys, other groups have done surveys where we find that sizable chunks of the population believe that is something available today. Bryant, very broad question, but kind of, who and what is responsible for the overhype of this current state of technology, and how can we address that?
Yeah, that was my fault. My bad.
Great, problem solved.
Yeah, I vow to do better. Yeah, so this is part of any technology. There's in the Gardner hype curve that describes this very notion. We all get excited. We all treat press releases as fact. We treat predictions as current reality. Many of us are not going to read the technical reports, not even the articles, we're going to read the headlines. And that creates kind of a general perception that is at odds with what is truly feasible or what our reality is. There's also a lot of commercial self-interest here. And there have been a number of marketing campaigns. Foremost has been Tesla's, and Tesla is not the only one, but it has been far the biggest offender in painting a picture of a reality that does not exist. Tesla uses the term full self-drive to describe a system that requires a driver that is linguistically impossible. In the same way, I can call my umbrella a parachute, but that does not make it true. It just makes it more dangerous. So this kind of circumspection is really essential in the language that reporters use. And here's a paper for questions that reporters can ask, in the language that companies use. And it's in companies' long-term interest to build that trust. Right? A company that says, we don't have an automated system yet, here's what we need to do to get one, here's what's hard, will be much more credible and believable when they come back a few years later and say, you know what, we've done it, we're ready. Now you can trust us because you could trust us before. And it's important that regulators and others who influence public discourse also bring a combination of hope, telling a story of what's possible, while also bringing a message of reality and circumspection, talking about what's hard and what steps remain. I've seen there are a couple of questions about when we can get these things. There are a couple of companies that plan to introduce level 3 features so that if you buy a very expensive new vehicle on certain freeways in certain low speed traffic jam conditions, you will, as a technical matter, be able to look away, not actively supervise driving. If you fly to a couple of places in the world, you can take a low-speed shuttle where you are a passenger in the same way you're a passenger in a taxi. Beyond that, I think we'll be rather surprised by the next few years, both in what does happen and what doesn't happen. And a great example of that are the low-speed sidewalk delivery robots that in many ways are automated and was not the sort of thing that people were talking about a decade ago. Like everything we expect to be here tomorrow will take a long time. It's the things we don't even expect that will surprise us tomorrow.
Absolutely. And since those autonomous vehicle pilots that we've mentioned a couple times here, since they aren't available everywhere in the US, a lot of people's main exposure to the idea of autonomous technology often comes from pop culture sources like movies and TV shows. Anuja, you did a wonderful video with your company Steer last year where you reacted to different self-driving car portrayals in movies. Could you talk a little bit about what perceptions of AVs people might have from pop culture and how those might be correct or incorrect and tie into this idea Bryant was talking about?
So that was a very interesting video, I will say, from pop culture. And, what it showed us is the perception of driverless vehicles is all over the place, right? And our wonderful team did a great job of actually picking a little bit from everywhere. But it's a very realistic perception in some of the movies that are very high tech, like the James Bond series and the Knight Riders, and they were ahead of its time. But they were very realistic in their portrayals, like where the James Bond vehicle is driverless, but in order to go driverless, it first waits for a command from James. And unless he gives the go ahead, it's not starting. So it's like almost like a level 4. Like it's still waiting for him. It's not doing something like a level 5 and cognitively aware of what it needs to do and things like that. And then you have these very romanticized versions or exorcised versions in some cases. But what was common is that there is a fascination in pop culture with human-less vehicles, and they almost have a larger-than-life persona, a very larger-than-life image, superior to humans, but still subservient to humans. So serving as a human aid or an assistant in most cases to make life better, more efficient, more high-tech tech, more cool or whatever until your car gets pissed off at you. But so there is realism in there. So these AVs will always be serving the good of the better of mankind, whoever their owner is and stakeholder is. It's very true. That's how they're intended to be. What I found was that typical to what human nature is, we are in an information overload era where we are consuming information from all kinds of sources, social, whether it's social media, whether it's news, whether it's blogs, etc. And I find that messaging also about showing something that human nature is, if you say something often enough, people will believe you. Nobody goes back and cross checks whether is this correct, or they don't sometimes even use their logic to say, oh, this is contradictory from what I heard earlier. And so if you say it loud enough and often enough, it gets treated as, oh, that's real. People mix perception and fact together. And so some of the for-profit companies out there have been guilty of putting out messages that, there's a very clear example Bryant gave earlier. They're very guilty of putting out a very biased, not true message and skewing. And then also the media, right? The media has a love and hate relationship with AVs, and sometimes the honeymoon period is going on, and you'll see that come across in the entire media. And sometimes there's a hate relationship going on, and you'll see that in the media. But my message is that, for the AV companies, is that you have to build trust. There's no other way to do it. If you start small, start small. If you start limited, start limited. Limited geographies, limited geography, it doesn't matter, but you have to build trust. You have to start small, get it in the hands of people, get them to be using it in the safest manner that you can put it out there with an easy button and foolproofed, and let it roll. If we wait for that fully autonomous level 5 system, to Brian's point, it's going to take years to get to that level of perception. But we can provide assistance technologies from a level 2 onwards and upwards that keeps on buying trust. And then little by little, you get the next superior version of that. And then you get the next superior version of that. And then that's another level up. And so level up means humans get to back out a little bit more and a little bit more and so forth, and then get that experiential process going out there. And that's the way to earn trust and adoption at the same time.
Absolutely. The time has flown by, but I'd like to get in one more question for you, Bryant, which is, what is the human driving benchmark to which an autonomous vehicle should be compared? Is it all driving, just unimpaired driving, vehicles with ADAS? How do we think about comparing human and automated systems?
Oh gosh, yeah, it's like asking how safe should my toaster be? Well, safer than the last one that burned on my house. And this is a challenge, right? Because prospectively, we don't know how to define safety. We don't know how to measure it because we don't have data. And we expect that benchmark will always increase as the technologies get better. That's why law has embraced this tension between certainty and flexibility. We want clear rules, but we also want the ability after the fact to say, no, that wasn't reasonable. You should have done more. So I want to build from Anuja's answer and say, looking forward now, the key question is, are the companies developing and deploying these technologies worthy of our trust? Because trustworthiness of the companies is probably the best proxy for the long-term safety of their systems. Now, after an individual crash, we can look back and we can benchmark it in at least 3 ways. One is to say, was the system as good as an individual human would have been performing that specific maneuver? Was the system as good as a comparable automated driving system, a comparable automated vehicle in that maneuver? And did the system avoid making the same mistake twice, which is a newer concept in law? But these are, I think, the 3 ways that after an individual crash will assess that question. I think far more important for our purposes at this point is that prospective forward-looking question of, is the company that's claiming safety worthy of our trust?
Very well said. And I'm impressed that you wrapped that up so quickly. That does hit us at the end of our 30 minutes for this panel, AV Fact and Fiction. Thank you so much, Bryant and Anuja, for joining PAVE and our audience. It was an absolute delight.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Great questions.
Great questions. It was my pleasure.
Great. And if you in the audience, if you want to follow up with PAVE or one of these panels today, please reach out via our website at www.pavecampaign.org or any of our social media accounts at PAVE Campaign. We'll be sending a link out later today to everybody who registered that includes this full recording on our YouTube channel and a link to our new podcast if you prefer to get your info that way. Thank you to the audience, as I mentioned, for submitting such great questions, attending, sending this to your friends, spreading the word. We really appreciate it and hope you all have a great rest of your day.